The Coffee Ritual, Wild West Story, narrated by an old cowboy. Chapter 1. The first cup. I suppose every man reaches a point in his life where he figures his story is mostly written, and all that's left is watching the pages turn until the book closes for good. That's where I was at 63 years old, drifting through the Arizona Territory with nothing but my horse, my saddle, and memories of better days when I had a family and a purpose beyond just staying alive one more sunrise. My name's Wesley Wes Carter, and I'd spent 40 years working cattle across every territory west of the Mississippi. Started as a green kid in Texas, worked my way up to trail boss, and eventually became foreman on one of the biggest spreads in Montana. But age catches up with every cowboy eventually, and younger men with faster reflexes and stronger backs started taking the jobs I'd once held without question. The arthritis in my hands made roping difficult. My knees protested every time I mounted a horse, and the ranch owners who'd once valued my experience started seeing me as a liability rather than an asset. So I'd taken to drifting, picking up odd jobs where I could find them, sleeping under the stars more often than under a roof, and generally accepting that I'd probably die alone somewhere on the trail. That's how I ended up on the outskirts of a small settlement called Mesa Ridge, camped beside a creek that ran through what appeared to be an abandoned homestead. The main house was still standing, but needed serious repairs. The barn had seen better days, and the fences were falling apart in sections. It looked like a place where dreams had died, along with whoever had tried to make a life there. I was brewing my morning coffee over a small fire when I heard voices approaching through the scrub brush. My hand moved instinctively toward my gun, old habits from dangerous years dying hard. But I relaxed when I saw it was just a woman and two children making their way toward the creek with water buckets. The woman was maybe 30 years old, with the kind of tired beauty that comes from working too hard for too long. Her dress was patched but clean, her hair tied back in a practical bun, and her eyes held the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust strangers easily. The children with her were a boy of about 10 and a girl maybe 7 or 8, both skinny but healthy looking, both watching me with the mixture of curiosity and caution that frontier kids develop early. "Morning, ma'am," I called out, making sure to keep my hands visible and my posture non-threatening. "Didn't mean to camp so close to your property. I'll move along if I'm causing trouble." The woman studied me for a long moment before responding. "You're not on my property, mister. This side of the creek is public land. You've got as much right to be here as anyone." "Appreciate the hospitality," I said, touching the brim of my hat in respect. "Name's Wesley Carter. Most folks call me Wes. Emma Sullivan," she replied, still maintaining her careful distance. "These are my children, Thomas and Sarah." The boy, Thomas, was staring at my horse with obvious interest, while little Sarah seemed fascinated by my campfire and the coffee pot bubbling over the flames. Kids who grew up without much often found simple things more interesting than wealthy children ever would. "That smells good," Sarah said suddenly, her young voice breaking the careful formality of the adult conversation. "We don't get real coffee very often. Mama makes us drink chicory most days." "Sarah," Emma's face flushed with embarrassment at her daughter's comment. "That's not polite conversation," but I just laughed, the first genuine amusement I'd felt in weeks. "Nothing wrong with chicory, miss. I've drunk plenty of it myself over the years. But I'll tell you a secret. Real coffee tastes better when you share it with good company." I poured a small amount into my tin cup and offered it to Emma. "If you don't mind taking coffee from a stranger." "That is?" Emma hesitated, clearly torn between pride and the simple pleasure of a luxury she couldn't afford. Finally, practical need won out over pride, and she accepted the cup with a small nod of thanks. "When's the last time you had real coffee?" I asked as she took a sip. "My husband died 2 years ago," Emma said quietly, her eyes distant with memory. "Patrick always made sure we had coffee, even when we couldn't afford much else. He said starting the day right was important." The pain in her voice was familiar. I'd lost my own wife to fever 20 years earlier, and I'd never remarried. Some losses cut so deep that you just learned to live around the hole they left, rather than trying to fill it. Patrick was right about that, I agreed. A good cup of coffee and a moment of peace before the day's troubles start. That's worth more than people realize. Thomas had edged closer to my camp while his mother and I talked, his eyes studying my gear with the intensity of a boy who was trying to figure out the world through observation. "Are you a real cowboy, mister?" he asked. "I suppose I am, son. Been working cattle most of my life. Did you know my papa?" Thomas asked with the hope of children who believe all adults must somehow know each other. He was going to teach me about ranching before he died. The simple statement hit me harder than it should have. This boy growing up without a father to teach him the skills he'd need. This woman trying to hold on to a homestead alone. These children facing a future of hardship that they'd done nothing to deserve. "I didn't know your papa," I admitted. "But I bet he was a good man, and I know he'd be proud of how you're helping your mama." After Emma and the children filled their water buckets and prepared to leave, young Sarah turned back to look at me with the directness that only children possess. "Will you still be here tomorrow, Mr. West?" "I might be, miss." "Why do you ask?" "Because if you are, I could bring you some of Mama's biscuits to go with your coffee. She makes the best biscuits in the whole territory." Emma looked embarrassed by her daughter's forward behavior, but I could see a flicker of something else in her eyes. Maybe hope, or maybe just the recognition that even strangers could use a little kindness in a hard world. "Sarah, Mr. Carter probably has places to be," Emma said gently. "Actually, I'm in no particular hurry," I heard myself saying, surprising myself with the words. "And I haven't had good biscuits in longer than I can remember. If you're serious about that offer, miss, I'd be honored to accept." That's how it started. A simple exchange of coffee for biscuits, stranger to stranger. Loneliness reaching out to loneliness without either of us quite admitting what we were doing. The next morning, true to her word, little Sarah came walking up to my camp, carrying a basket covered with a clean cloth. Thomas was with her, and together they brought not just biscuits, but also some bacon and eggs that Emma had sent along. "Mama said, you probably don't eat proper breakfasts." "Living on the trail," Thomas explained as Sarah carefully laid out the food. "She said it's not charity, just neighborly kindness." I could tell that Emma had rehearsed that last part with them, wanting to make sure I didn't feel like I was accepting handouts. Pride is a funny thing in frontier country. Sometimes it's all people have left, and you learn to respect it even when it makes practical help harder to give or receive. "You tell your mama I'm grateful for the neighborly kindness," I said. "And you tell her that tomorrow morning I'll have coffee ready for anyone who wants to share it." That became our routine. Each morning, Sarah and Thomas would come walking up with food from their mother's kitchen, and I'd have fresh coffee brewing and stories to tell about life on the trail. The children would sit on logs around my campfire, listening to tales about cattle drives and wild horses, and the various characters I'd met during my years of wandering. After about a week, Emma herself started coming along with the children. At first, she'd just stay for a few minutes, making sure her kids weren't being a burden, but gradually, those minutes stretched into longer conversations about ranching, about the challenges of maintaining a homestead alone, and about life in general. "You're good with children," Emma observed one morning after Thomas and Sarah had run off to play by the creek. "They've needed a man's influence since Patrick died." "I had a daughter once," I admitted, surprising myself with the confession. "She'd be about Sarah's age if she'd lived. Viva took her and my wife both, back in '68. Emma's eyes filled with understanding and shared sorrow. "I'm sorry. That's a hard loss to carry." "Every loss is hard," I replied. "But maybe that's why we recognize the weight others are carrying. Makes it easier to help shoulder the load." Chapter 2. Coffee and Conversation. 3 weeks had passed since that first morning by the creek, and what had started as a simple exchange of coffee and breakfast had evolved into something that felt almost like family. I'd stopped thinking of myself as just camping near Emma, Sullivan's property, and started feeling like I was somehow part of the daily rhythm of their lives. Thomas had taken to following me around when I wasn't actively working. asking endless questions about ranching and soaking up knowledge with the desperate intensity of a boy who knew he was supposed to be learning these things from his father. I found myself teaching him things I hadn't realized I still remembered. How to read cattle behavior, how to judge good grazing land, how to repair tack and equipment with whatever materials were at hand. Little Sarah was different. She'd attached herself to me with the simple trust of a child who decided I was safe and interesting. She'd bring me flowers she'd picked, show me rocks she'd found by the creek, and tell me elaborate stories about imaginary adventures that reminded me painfully of my own daughter's creativity. "Mr. Wes," Sarah said one morning as we sat drinking coffee together, "are you going to stay here forever?" The question caught me off guard, as children's questions often do. "I don't know, sweetheart. I hadn't really thought about forever. You should stay," she declared with the absolute certainty that children bring to important pronouncements. "Thomas needs someone to teach him man things, and Mama smiles more when you're here, and I like having someone to tell my stories to." From the mouths of babes, as they say. Sarah had articulated something that had been building in my mind for weeks, but that I'd been too stubborn or scared to acknowledge. Emma's homestead was struggling not because she wasn't capable, but because the work required two people rather than one. The fences needed mending, the barn needed repairs, the well pump needed fixing, and a dozen other tasks demanded skills and strength that Emma simply didn't have time or ability to provide, while also managing. Everything else I'd started helping, with small repairs, almost without thinking about it. Fixing a loose board here or tightening a hinge there, justifying each task as just being a good neighbor. But the truth was deeper than neighborliness. I was starting to care about these people, and caring was dangerous for a man who'd spent 20 years protecting his heart from exactly that vulnerability. "Wes," Emma said one evening as we sat on her porch after the children had gone to bed, "I need to talk to you about something." Her serious tone made me nervous, and I braced myself for whatever was coming. "You've been here almost a month now," she continued, "and in that time, you've fixed more things around this place than I could have managed in a year. Thomas is learning things he needs to know, and Sarah has stopped having nightmares about being alone." She paused, gathering her courage. "What I'm trying to say is that you've become important to us, and I don't want you to feel obligated to stay out of some sense of duty, but I also don't want you to leave without knowing that you'd be missed." The honesty of her words deserved equal honesty in return. "Emma, I've been drifting for 20 years because staying in one place hurt too much after losing my family. Every time I started to feel at home somewhere, I'd get scared and move on before I could get too attached." I took a breath before continuing. "But something about this place, about you and the kids, makes me want to stop running. I'm 63 years old, and I'm tired of sleeping on the ground and eating beans from a can. When I drink my morning coffee here, listening to Sarah's stories and answering Thomas's questions, I feel like maybe I could have a purpose again." Emma's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "What are you saying, Wes?" "I'm saying that I'd like to stay if you'll have me. Not as charity and not as obligation, but as a partner in working this land. I've got some money saved up from my working years, and I've got skills that this place needs. And maybe—" I hesitated, then pushed forward. "Maybe I need this place and these people as much as you need help managing it all. The Cowboy has decided to stay. But will the arrangement work? And what will the neighbors say? Subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to see how this family comes together." Chapter 3. This porch feels like home. The morning light was just starting to paint the Arizona sky in shades of gold and pink as I sat on Emma Sullivan's porch, a cup of fresh coffee in my weathered hands and the sound of children laughing in the yard. 6 months had passed since that first morning by the creek, and somewhere along the way, this porch had stopped feeling like someone else's property and started feeling like home. Thomas was in the barn, tending to the horses with the competence of a boy who'd learned his lessons well. At 11 years old, he could already rope better than some grown men I'd known, and his understanding of animal behavior showed the kind of natural instinct that couldn't be taught, only nurtured. His father would have been proud. Sarah was playing with the barn cat, her laughter ringing across the yard like music. At 8 years old, she'd lost the haunted look that had shadowed her eyes when I first met her, and her imagination had found new outlets in the expanding world that came from having someone to share her stories with. Emma emerged from the house, carrying her own cup of coffee, and settled into the chair beside mine. A comfortable silence falling between us that spoke of familiarity and trust, built over months of shared work and conversation. "Thomas asked me yesterday when you were going to move into the house," Emma said quietly. "He doesn't understand why you're still sleeping in the barn." I'd been sleeping in the barn by choice, maintaining the pretense that I was a hired hand rather than something more complicated. The arrangement had protected both of us from having to define what we were becoming to each other, but it also created a distance that was starting to feel more harmful than helpful. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him that grown-ups sometimes need time to figure things out," Emma replied. "But the truth is, Wes, I'm tired of figuring things out. I know what I feel, and I think I know what you feel, but we're both too scared to say it out loud." She was right, of course. In the months I'd been helping with the homestead, something had shifted between us. What started as practical partnership had evolved into something deeper, built on shared morning coffees, evening conversations, and the daily intimacy of building a life together. "I'm 20 years older than you," I said, voicing one of the fears that had kept me silent. "When Sarah's grown, I'll be an old man." "You're already an old man," Emma replied with gentle humor. "But you're also kind, patient, good with children, and the best thing that's happened to this family since Patrick died." She reached over and took my hand, her work-roughened fingers intertwining with mine. "I'm not asking you to replace Patrick. That's not possible, and it wouldn't be right. But I am asking you to stop sleeping in the barn and start being the partner and father figure you've already become in every way except name." Before I could respond, Thomas came running up to the porch, his young face urgent with news. "Mama, Mr. Wes, Sheriff Morrison is riding up the road with some other men." The peaceful morning shattered as we saw 5 riders approaching the homestead, led by Sheriff Tom Morrison and including several men I recognized as representatives of the Mesa Ridge Town Council. Their expression suggested this wasn't a social call. "Mrs. Sullivan," Morrison called out as the riders reached the porch, "we need to talk to you about your property rights and some concerns that have been raised about your situation here." The careful emphasis on situation made it clear they were referring to my presence on the homestead, and the implications weren't favorable. "What concerns?" Emma asked, her voice steady despite the obvious threat. One of the council members, a pompous man named Harold Whitmore, spoke up. "It's been brought to our attention that you have an unmarried man living on your property with you and your children. This creates a moral situation that the community finds concerning." I felt rage building in my chest, but Emma squeezed my hand in warning before I could respond. "Mr. Carter has been helping me maintain my homestead," Emma said calmly. "He works for room and board, which is a common arrangement throughout the territory." "Perhaps," Whitmore conceded, "but the appearance of impropriety is damaging to the community's moral standards. We're here to suggest that Mr. Carter find accommodation elsewhere, or that you formalize your arrangement through proper marriage." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. They were forcing us to choose between separation or marriage, using social pressure to dictate how we lived our lives. Sheriff Morrison, who'd been silent during Whitmore's speech, finally spoke up. "Emma, Wes, I want you to know this isn't my idea. I think what you've built here is admirable. But the council has the authority to make these kinds of determinations about community standards." I stood up, my coffee forgotten, and faced the men who thought they had the right to dictate my life. "With all due respect, gentlemen, what Emma Sullivan and I do on her property is our business, not yours." "Actually," Whitmore replied smugly, It becomes our business when it affects the community's reputation. We have standards to maintain. Emma stood beside me, her chin lifted with pride and determination. Mr. Whitmore, let me be clear about something. Wes Carter is the best man I've known since my husband died. He's been a father figure to my children, a partner in working this land, and a friend when I needed one most. She paused, then continued with words that changed everything. And if the choice is between losing him or marrying him, then I choose marriage. Not because you're forcing me to, but because it's what I want. Emma turned to me, her eyes holding a question and a challenge. That is, if Wes is willing. All those years of running from commitment, all that fear of losing people I cared about, all the protective walls I'd built around my heart, they all crumbled in that moment as I looked at this brave woman who'd just declared her intentions in front of witnesses who'd come to condemn her. Emma Sullivan, I said, my voice rough with emotion. I'd be honored to be your husband and a proper father to Thomas and Sarah, not because these gentlemen are demanding it, but because this porch has felt like home since the day I first sat on it. The wedding took place 2 weeks later, a simple ceremony attended by the few friends Emma had maintained, and the children who were delighted to finally have official claim to the man who'd been acting as their father for months. Thomas stood beside me as I made my vows, his young face serious with the weight of the moment. Sarah was Emma's attendant, her smile bright enough to shame the sun. And when the preacher declared us married, both children rushed forward to hug us, cementing the family we'd become. That evening, as we sat together on the porch, drinking coffee and watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of fire, Sarah climbed into my lap and asked the question that had been hanging in the air all day. Can we call you Papa now, Mr. Wes? I felt Emma's hand slip into mine as I answered. I'd like that very much, sweetheart. Thomas, trying to maintain his dignity as the man of the family despite his youth, settled for a more formal approach. I think I'll call you sir, if that's all right. Call me whatever feels right, son, I replied. The label matters less than knowing we're family now. Years later, when Thomas had grown into a fine rancher and Sarah had become a teacher in Mesa Ridge, people would ask me how I'd ended up settling down after 40 years of drifting. I'd tell them it started with a cup of coffee shared with strangers, evolved through daily rituals of breakfast and conversation, and culminated in the simple realization that home isn't a place. It's the people who make you want to stop running. And every morning I'd sit on that porch with my coffee, watching the sun rise over the land we'd built together. And I'd think about how a simple offer of neighborly kindness had given me back the family I thought I'd lost forever. Sometimes the best things in life sneak up on you disguised as temporary arrangements. And before you know it, you're looking around and realizing that temporary has become permanent. And that's exactly where you want to be. What a beautiful journey from lonely drifter to beloved father and husband. Wes proved that family isn't just blood, it's the bonds we choose to build. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more heartwarming tales of found families in the Old West. Share this touching story with everyone who believes it's never too late to find home. What was your favorite moment in Wes's transformation? Let us know in the comments below.